Very adventurous, Espen, and in some places, like masterful, I would say. I love your reinterpretation of certain runs. Those little 16th runs. Um, I like some of um, the dramatic contrasts of proportions. Some of them, I feel that you could put in a little fix here and there to make it to kind of pull it closer to Beethoven's particular kind of aesthetics, outlook, pacing, and so on. But there's no denying that there are so many cool things here. Um, yeah, if you had wanted this to be more of a classically oriented kind of a interpretation, this could be alto trombone. But I mean, you have decided to go with four chromatic horns, you know, chromatic trumpets in B flat, and so it might as well just be two tenor trombones scored in bass clef. Yeah, I feel like you are scoring to your strengths. Do you know what I mean? Like what is familiar to you, what sounds right to you. So, once again, like I would put this more in the category of a very strong personality, rather than trying to really sound period like, right? I mean, I think that you have a beautiful affinity for Beethoven's particular voice and style, but you don't let it dominate you. You just really find your own solutions to things, and your own kind of approach. And perhaps you would have felt more comfortable with more romantic or impressionistic work. Maybe that would have appealed to you more. But I think that you make a lot of things in this work really naturally, and I'm going to talk about them. Like sometimes I get a score where there really isn't a whole lot that's wrong or needs fixing, but it still is fascinating enough that it is worth to talk over. What works and why. So let's do that. Let's start off with the with the intro. So does the intro set the mood effectively? I mean, I feel that it does. I think that it's very, very strong. If there's anything that I would say maybe could use a little bit of work, if there was a way to connect the first horn line, first horn and third horn more seamlessly to the trumpets, because it just really feels, you can feel the seam here. Da 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 da. You can really hear the difference in timbre there. So if there was some way of dovetailing forwards, so that like the trumpets ended up sounding radiant as they started to emerge rather than just a clean cut, that would appeal more to me as an orchestrator. But there's nothing wrong with what you did here. It's I feel that like if the trumpets are playing, especially if they're on actual B flat trumpets, and they are playing in like a kind of a more, let's say that they were playing piston trumpets, or excuse me, valve trumpets rather than piston trumpets, so they kind of have like a more moderated sound, and they're really listening to the horns, and they're sort of kind of matching them as they start their little phrase here. Then I think that it would just clean itself up, right? And there's no faulting the way that you've scored the trombones and horns and so on. And I love the just like so basic bass trombone, right? That's all you need. You could mellow the timbre of this bass trombone with a single bassoon if you wanted to, right? So of course it'll still be about the sound of the bass trombone, but it won't be quite as trebly. Do you know what I mean? But anyhow, all that aside, it sounds really, really great. And I like the slurring pattern that you've got here. Yeah, that all works great. You could have started the slur here too, right? So that you're not slurring over repeated notes in your low horns, or yeah. Okay, so that's all good. Setting mood effectively, yes. Now, does the melody start with elegance? It does, and this is one of the one of those entries that agrees with my outlook on how to divide the bowing, right? This could have also just slurred over all three pitches here in your upper strings right at the end. Yeah, so you just really keep it straightforward, all in the strings. You've got a natural flow to the accompaniment. Beautifully elegant delivery of the theme here. Natural transition to octaves, just built right into the string parts, and I like just like the little bit of bassoon that you put in here, kind of adding that voice below that isn't in the strings, and that I feel is a very powerful way of. It's almost like adding an extra cello part or like a baritone viola part to it, right? Because it blends into what's going on in the strings without calling too much attention to itself. So that's really, really nice. See, like there's, when I say, parts of this are masterful. So that's one example of that, right? So, starting with elegance, natural flow, natural transition to octaves, expanding without clogging up. And you find a beautiful way of expanding there with that bassoon. All right, and then we just go to the little leggermente section, and I think here, like if you're putting dolce here, you don't really need dolce in the lower string parts. Maybe in the viola part, right? Because they eventually play this section here. That's dolce. But you don't really. I mean, there's nothing really dolce about going dee da dee da dee da dee da 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 da. But yeah. So here you should add leggermente. If that's dolce, that's leggermente, right? And you're just telling the player, like it's a certain attitude, right? If this is being played sweetly, this is going to be played nimbly, with kind of an exaggerated sense of spryness or agility, right? And just very natural. Just first clarinet, and then boom. Here I wouldn't slur down the jumping down an octave here. I would just slur up and then this separately articulated. So da 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 or da ta ta, right? So yeah, so you didn't need to contrast between the two statements here, right? But you did contrast with the theme, right? So the starting in strings, and then going on to clarinets. And then, by the way, here this will tick the box already. I'm sort of jumping ahead a little bit, but you will also have a contrast like strings, clarinet, right? So you're really kind of keeping things fresh. Okay, and then here you just have staccatos, like you're keeping it really like on an even keel with your dynamics. You don't even need to mark a dynamic here if you're going to do this approach with the whole dynamic arc. And I love this yeah, I mean, and you don't even need to mark like mezzo forte or mezzo piano or whatever in the middle. It's just like it'll just be whatever the conductor wants. They lean into it a little bit, though you'll get a little bit more volume here. If you're the conductor, you can just decide that on the spot. Yeah, so that all sounds great. Like, do you have an emphatic color of line? You have a homogeneous color of line, right? Do you have harmonic density setting up the next thing? You do, and that is just going straight into strings, right? Here you could have this in two separate voices with, here's a way of doing it. All right. Let's make that into second voice. Hang on a second here. All right. So take this. Oh, for goodness sakes. Sorry about that. Okay, so that goes over the top. This goes on the bottom. I just hate the way that the screen jumps around. It's so dumb. All right, and then the second voice here. I'll just select the second voice. Give it some tenutos. Stupid. You know what I'm saying? And then here you can, like, this is something Sibelius hasn't learned yet, that when there is a portato like this, that the slur should sit behind, on top of or below the tenuto marks, right? Okay. Alrighty. So that would be one way of keeping this really smooth, right? So like even though this like the C's would be right, you still get the smooth sound overall, and that it blends in together with the ear. And then this is really lovely, kind of going to bum bum da da da, and then all together bum. It's really really good. So it's just very very simple, direct scoring. You're not doing anything too fancy. All right, and then Dolce. Yeah, I mean you could say this is sweet, right? I guess. Da da. Yeah, and complementary timbre. I mean, it just strings, right? There's nothing too complicated. Right, and then you just end here, da, 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 and this is really lovely the way that you managed all of this, and this is something that I could kind of see as a Beethoven type solution, right? It's not too different from what we see in the string quartet, based on the Ninth Sonata, right? It's like he really kind of simplifies his left hand patterns, and some of those kind of cycling things that happen. They're just really controlled, and they are given a more straightforward kind of energy, and which works better on strings, right? So yeah, so I feel that this is just very valid what you're doing in here. Yeah, and then just like little bits of horn kind of crawling downwards with the strings and so on. So that's all really beautiful. And then here you're going dun, da, 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 with little booms on the timpani, yeah, and that just really works for me. And then this sort of drops downwards. I just wish that if there's any way of like keeping this kind of burbling energy a little bit higher, so it was still kind of almost intersecting between these octaves here, right? Like, what if this part had been given to the violas, right where it is there, and then this part was given to the seconds an octave higher, right? Anyways, that's one way of possibly managing it. So yeah, and then this is really lovely. This little coming back, and then yeah, and this is all, yeah, that all works great. And we've got this bum ba-dum ba-dum ba-dum. All right. So here was like one of the aesthetic decisions, one of the aesthetic choices that you chose right here, right? And that is like as more and more excitement is generated in the orchestration, there's a sort of there's almost like I feel a necessity to kind of start to build on this texture, as the gap widens further in the harmony, so that there's just more and more meat on the bones. Okay, however, you chose to really hold off on adding any kind of fat texture until we get to right here, right? And then when we look ahead, it's just like that's it. You give us one bar of a tutti here, right? So yeah. So I mean, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, right? That is not the judgment that I'm making, but I'm just wondering whether or not like you would get more impact out of your crescendo, your gradual crescendo here, if we just slowly insinuated more and more harmony, say, starting with clarinets and then adding horns, and then finally you had this big brilliant push. However, if you aesthetically feel that the push needs to wait for just before the the end of the one bar before the end of the entire phrase, then or passage I should say, then that works for me if it works for you. But yeah, and the other thing too is like no timpani roll. That's all right. I mean, why does there always have to be a roll in the timpani? And this is that big, nice, nicely stacked string chord here. I would say that you might be better off here with the violas playing the thirds, and then just all of the second violins just playing one single note, right? And the violas could play it non-divisi, right? Which maybe works better in this big fat kind of sound here. Okay. All right, and then here you've got sort of trading off between the players. And something, like one clarinet player could handle this entire thing, right, with no problem at all, and it would sound beautiful and connected and consistent. Right? And then maybe you give this part to the second player. And I love the little pizzicato that you got in here. So when you got to this C section, new quality of tone. You tend to be going back and forth between the strings and the clarinets, right? And maybe that's more familiar to you. Maybe you are more experienced scoring for clarinet, or maybe you are a clarinetist or something. But just be careful once again, that it isn't just a conversation between strings and clarinet and strings and clarinet and strings before and then clarinet. Do you see what I'm saying? Just be careful about your strategies for freshening up the different functions. All right, but what I really like is the way that you just go straight into the strings here. Da 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 da, and then just taking this da 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 da, and just adding. Jumping everything up an octave. I think that works beautiful, and that is really kind of getting more into the mentality of the original score, the piano score. And then it's just so beautifully casual. The middle strings and the bassoon doubling each other, right? And then just a little bit of oboe on top here. And then just just these little things, and then this thing right in here knocked me out. It was great. I would mark it pianissimo though. Okay, just keep it more in the background a little bit, especially for the first horn is going to be just naturally more bright right here. And you probably don't even need a slur there, if they're playing in the background. They might just go to the next pitch, and you won't really hear a breath right in here. Yeah, but this is all really lovely in here. And then this repeat back to the A section is really, really, really well done. All right, so let's compare all of that. All right, before we jump forwards to compare A, B, and C with E, let's go back and refresh your memory about what Espen did. We've been looking at this, so this was just a straight interpretation of violins with a little bit of help from bassoon. Then we had clarinets and bassoon, or clarinet and bassoon, go back and forth in the leggermente section, which you should put in. And then we had this so all in strings, answering winds, strings answering winds. Then we had the clarinet and these lovely little horns working their way down and so on. And then the part that we just looked at here at C, once again clarinets and bassoons working together, pizzicato and so on. And all right, so got that. All right, so now let's jump ahead to E. Oops, a little too far that time. All right, so it starts off very similar. Da 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 da. Now you're adding a layer on top of flute. And then we have the fattening of the first violins with oboe, and we've got the sort of radiant octave above, which will get absorbed into the color of the oboe and the first violins, right? So if you're aware of that, if you're counting on that, and then look here, you did a slur over the 3 pitches rather than just 2 and then an up bow. So you should do that at the beginning too. Yeah. And then, of course, bassoon helping out below. So, yeah, so that is just really beautiful. So you just added a little bit, you added a little filigree of color there, right? So just, that was so nice. Okay, and then here, back to clarinet versus bassoon, or clarinet and bassoon dialogue. Once again, try to end the slur right here, and then this separately articulated. And then and then here you're just stacking colors, right? It's the same basic approach all the way through, except now you're adding flute on top, and then you're doubling that octave in your first violins with a little bit of cello supporting, and then we got some basses down here, right? So just like, once again, you're kind of upping the color scheme without really changing too much. And then same thing as before, da 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 da, and then you come in with your flutes, ba da 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 dum bum bum, and a full tutti here. So that's like the first big difference, right? So this is really very similar, and in this case, the thing that also changes is like pushing forward to a forte here. It almost necessitates that this be really big. So, but okay, my only problem here is that I feel that this is so bright, so suddenly. Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, and of course, like you could say, well, Beethoven had his, bursts of joy, his fits of temper, and so on and so forth. And that may be true, but it's like there is just a sudden, da 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 da. Do you know what I mean? Like we're pushing towards a forte, and then suddenly we are jumping up, in terms of the mass of resonance. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's if there's any way to ease in some other colors, like maybe, maybe the winds could start to insinuate themselves, like the lower winds, middle winds could sort of push forwards, like it just come in at pianissimo or piano and then push towards the forte, so that it wouldn't be so darn sudden. Right? Okay, and I think we missed an opportunity here for a little timpani. Bum, 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 and then this is lovely. Answering winds, dun, 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 answering strings. Right, and then same thing, tutti, answering winds, tutti, answering strings. So it's a nice back and forth. That also has a nice flavor of Beethoven to it as well. And just, like you just really kept it straightforward and, really well plotted out, nicely balanced tutti chords all the way through. And then this is lovely, just coming back in with a teeny bit of flute and clarinet alongside the strings, handing or setting up the next part here. Right, and then once again clarinet, da 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 da, ba da. This time flutes underneath the clarinets, and that actually works pretty well. Da 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 da. So long as there isn't anything else happening here, right? Just one little point, and that is that the strength of the oboe in this register compared to the flutes is going to be very pronounced, right? I wish that there was another way of doing this, like maybe just continuing the flutes, or if you had a third clarinet or something, these could both be clarinets or something. Or, what you could do is you could have the top line a duet flutes, and then you could have the bottom line second clarinet, right? So there's just like different ways around it, just to keep the very cool color of the flute contrasting so severely with the warm color of the oboe here. Yeah, and then we're kind of going back to this. Yeah, it's just all really easy to play. And then and this is all pretty much the same solutions as before. Yeah, and once again, I wish that there had been a voice continuing on the pattern in between these two. So here, this is more like what I was talking about before. You're having some horns coming in and insinuating themselves and pushing forward. But like, I think that this down here, what's wrong with like trombone doubling this or bassoons doubling this, right? Why do we have to lose strength here? Why does the bassoon have to drop out? Right, and then you could be piling on a little bit more clarinet and bassoon here, just so that this isn't quite so, I like the forte piano then push again. That's nice. That does kind of solve some of the problem, but you still get the big, you still get a big flare on the downbeat here. And you can go forte piano on these string and wind parts too. All right, so I've mentioned before, like, a lot of trills in a lot of winds at once is, it can be a bit unnerving, in practice. In principle and in the mock-up, it can sound kind of fun. Wow, this needs to be justified. Okay, better. Okay. But yeah, I mean, I almost feel like you might be better off here with clarinets and bassoons. Like one of the bassoons, right, could be mellowing out the bass trombone timbre here. Then the other one could be trilling, and then one of your clarinets could be maybe adding to some of the harmony above the first trombone, while the other one trills. And then both of these trills could be supported somewhat by divisi, viola and cello, adding other notes to it, right? Just to mellow the sound of that wind trill a little bit. All right, and then pow. And then, here, I like this variation on the timbre. So instead of just having clarinets do everything, you've got flute coming in, and once again, this would just be beautiful for just a single flute, right? So first flute, then maybe second flute could answer, right? And, this is all really well done. I love the little pizzicato here. And then, yeah, and this is just really nicely done. And then I love the little way that you work your way down. Clarinet taken over by flute, and then clarinet back and forth with the flute, and then reaching down here to bassoon, and then cello coming in underneath it, and then we're starting to get this done. And I love you take that little horn line that you had before, a sort of soaring line, and you push upwards. I think that's very cool, along with the first and second violins. And just a little touch of viola coming in over the top here. This could, you could add a little bit of clarinet to this too, if you wanted to. Or, clarinet, bassoon, right? So you've got your clarinets doing something else. Just for a teeny bit more color, if you want this to really stand out. Yeah, and then bassoons with violas. Yeah, and then I just love the way that, like, you were just scrubbing around down here, and then you just go ya da 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 while you're going yaka daga 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 with your second violins, right? And then just like immediately hides what's going on. Then ba da, almost like the da da da. It's really lovely, and then da 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 da, and this would be all détaché, right? This is where I would say it would be fine to mark détaché. Just to really kind of, like in the light of so many other slurred parts, and then also to have the player just really play it with a bouncing middle of their bow. It's a bit of a jump downward to this E, but not a big deal, really, for any pro player. Yeah, and then this is so cool. The seconds and the oboes and these little doot doot. Bum, 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 bum. And this da-da-da-da bonk. Okay, so that's all cool. And then the repeat is good. And, I like the fact that you don't do the da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. You just leave it out. You just go bonk, 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 da-da-da-da. So that's lovely. So let's jump back and look at the development. Yeah, I hope you didn't worry, Espen, if you have missed the way that I evaluate these, comparing ABC with E and then jumping back to D at the end. Da 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 da. Yeah, and you just keep it in the string. It's just very similar to what you did before. You know what? Why not put in a little bassoon here? You know what I mean? Maybe it could be adding a little bit of something right in here, like maybe doubling the double basses or something else. You could have something similar to what you had before. And this is so cool here. This just beautiful suspense. And then you're trading off, you're dovetailing to this. That's totally fine. All right, now here, did you notice in Spencer's performance, and maybe the performance of other pianists who you might have heard play this, that it's more than mezzo piano. It's more like mezzo forte, right? Da da da, bum ba bum 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 bum. It's a really good setup to have this come in a little stronger. And it doesn't have to be hugely strong, but just a little bit more muscle, because it really does, like, this doesn't hit so unexpectedly. This is one thing where I do think that Beethoven's Fit of Temper needs a little bit of a setup, right? So I think just up this a little bit. Then bum ba dum bum bum bum. This is really great here in the middle strings. Da 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 ba da dum bum ba bum da 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 ba da dum. Yeah, and just really lovely back and forth here. Yep, and then just getting getting a little bit of variety of color and section, right, or part of the orchestra. If this is the classical period, this would just suddenly be shifting to the right of the conductor and then going back to the left. Yeah, and then this is all very solid right in here. And this da-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum. Yeah, that all works really great. And then this all rushing downwards. This is a little fussy. I would prefer that you would go G-da-da-da-dum rather than rest-da-da-da-dum. It just is a lot more precise for the player to just come in right on the downbeat. Da-da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-da-dum. It doesn't matter if they're playing the same note again that the flute just played. It's just easier on them in terms of following the conductor and everything else, right? So try not to do this in these sort of really fast runs and these sort of precise passages. Not that you could never do it. It's just that, it's just easier on the player. And if your piece is only going to have a teeny bit of attention, like maybe it'll get read once, and that's the only time you'll ever hear it, right? So maybe just keep things as simple as possible. Or if it does make the rounds and it's being played by a lot of community orchestras, same thing, right? Yeah, but this is all real solid in here. Bum bum bum. So just mark a quarter note here and let the hall be the whole note, right? Boom. Right? Or you could go, if you really want to be modern about it, you could mark a C quarter note with a little unfinished tie after it. But I think that, like, it'd be better just to hit if we're really doing this in Beethoven style, just have a single quarter note, and just let the hall provide the sustain. Because all these other instruments here, your trombones and your basses and cellos here, and the bassoons, they're going to sustain the tone for you, right? I like the way that you back off with your winds, and you just let the strings and the brass take over here. Yeah, and then this da 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 dum bum bum. Yeah, and that all works really great. So so once again, I hope for my audience out there that I pointed out a lot of the really strong parts of this score, and how just a lot of things are just naturally right. I mean, of course, there's always room for improvement. Like, for instance, there should have been a crescendo mark under these cellos, for instance, right? There are still little editing things to do on this, and there are a few approaches that I feel, well, could this need could it be a little fatter at this point? Could there be a little bit more harmonic support or whatever? But that's all just, some of this is just more taste than it is craft, right? So so I feel it's just a very solid. There's very solid scoring here, and and I mean, all the same, even though, like, this isn't really period scoring, and yet it has like a real nice Beethoven feel to it. It has the mark of a very strong personality of an orchestrator. It's more personality driven perhaps than it is necessarily period driven, and yet in the same way, I feel like I'm hearing a lot of a lot of Beethoven's outlook here, especially in some of like the reimaginings of certain long running patterns that he's got, and the just reimagining the material in places, especially especially in places like this and so on, right? So yeah, so really great work. Thank you so much for sharing this, for the work you put into this, and for being so patient with me. It took a couple years before I was able to get to these. I that is not what I am famous for as a coach and as a somebody who organizes events. I'm more known for following through than I am for disappearing or falling off the edge of the earth. So please accept my humble apologies for that, and also my gratitude for for letting me find the time that I needed to heal and come back to this. And just also for the excellence of your scoring here. I feel you did a really great job, and I was really happy to look at it. So words of advice, feedback, thoughts, plaudits, all that in the comments below, my fellow orchestrators. And Espen, if you can do the same for some of the other entries in, especially here in this huge dotted brev category, which ended up with 26 scores in it. That would be awesome. Okay, so we are going to also look at an additional score today. This is going to be one of those days where there are 2 entries. And the reason why is I kind of want to plan things so that they sort of land on a Sunday for our remaining website entries, website subscriber entries. That's one. And then another reason is that I am this next video that we're going to look at is very, very short. It's just a brief excerpt from the second movement. So we're going to look at that today. I think it's, the shortness of this video, and the briefness of the next excerpt that we're going to look at just merits 2 videos in one day. All right, so take a look at that after you have watched this one, and hope to see you there. And thanks again, everybody.